I'm actually going to start this presentation about the future of work by talking a little bit about the past of work. So this is a picture of my grandfather, my dad, and me. Fun fact, all of us have given presentations about the future of work in our careers, which is just very strange. I could not find a picture of my grandfather actually giving it. I don't know what the photography, it wasn't like the Instagram era, so that's just a picture of him on the phone. But we were all thinking about the future of work because in some ways it's this great equalizer. You know, everyone is thinking about it wherever they are in their career, wherever they are in time, because they know that it's going to change. But actually the story of how work looked for each of us was pretty fundamentally different. So for my grandfather, he went to college for engineering, and after he graduated college, he joined a company, and he stayed there until he retired. He had different roles, he lived in different countries, but it was always affiliated with one company. And this sort of implicit contract that he made with that company was, I'm going to spend years of my life working for you, and you're going to take care of me. You're going to invest in me, you're going to give me a pension, like that's how my life is going to play out. My dad's career looked a little bit different. He also went to college for engineering. Then he joined Bell Labs right out of college. They paid for not one, but 2 of his graduate degrees, which sounds really nice. And he stayed there for about 10 years. And then he joined a new company, and he stayed there for about 15 years. And he's kind of now nearing retirement age. He's probably going to have affiliated with 5 different organizations over the course of his career. And the implicit contract he was making with these organizations was, hey, I'm going to come, I'm going to spend deep and focused time with you. I'm going to try and create some big change, and then I'm going to move on to something else, and it might not be in your organization. And then there's me. I'm obviously much more junior in my career, much less accomplished, but I've affiliated with 5 different organizations already, and I'm 31. I expect that my career is going to be a series of interesting projects, and the organizations that I affiliate with are going to change over the course of my career. I really like CoLab. I hope I stay here for a while, but I expect that over a 30 or 40-year career, there's going to be lots of different entities that I'm working with and for, and it's a story that has changed generationally. My grandfather's story looked different than my dad's, looked different than mine. And it hasn't just changed for the sort of corporate, white-collar work. This story is a little bit of revisionist history. My dad's actual first organizational affiliation was he was a bagger at a grocery store. And as I started to look into what it means to be a grocer, it's a really interesting lens to think about how work has changed and how it will continue to change. So in the 1920s, the grocery store looked really different from how we understand it today. People tended to visit the grocery store every day. You know, we didn't have refrigerators at home. You were going to the grocery store to pick up food every single day. And the actual grocer was doing a lot of the work that you as a consumer do today in the grocery store. So you'd go with a rough idea of what you wanted to make for dinner. They would pull all the products from the shelves. You didn't go back to the shelves. So they'd pull everything for you. They'd check for quality, you know, is this banana ripe, whatever. They'd help you figure out if you were missing an ingredient. They'd help you check out and pay. And really, you as the consumer, all you were doing was taking your groceries home. And you can kind of think about most jobs like this. There are a series of different tasks, and we allocate them either to the human worker, the consumer, or maybe a machine that's augmenting them. In the 1950s, we had a little bit of a restructuring, both driven by refrigeration as well as other innovations. We started to move to a more self-service model of going to the grocery store. This is probably the one we're all most familiar with. We're actually, you as a consumer, when I walk into Safeway, I go into the aisles, I pull all the products that I think I'm going to need. I came with a list. I look to see if the banana's ripe, and I go to the counter when I'm ready to check out and pay. And the worker is educating me on my options and answering questions, but a lot of what they're doing is helping me check out and pay. And I actually can't even make a graph like this for today because there are so many different models for how we think about going to the grocery store. So we have the extreme example of Amazon Go, where you as the consumer, it's extreme self-service, right? You're doing everything. The machine is checking out. The worker in this case is an engineer at Amazon in Seattle. That's the only human worker that you're interacting with. It's really implicit. Instacart, totally different model, right? Now, you as the consumer, you're identifying what you need, but there's a physical human who's going to the store, grabbing all those products for you, bringing them back, but they're not actually employed by the grocery store. They're employed by this third party, this gig organization, and actually they're not even employed, they're contractors, and they expect that they're doing that alongside probably many other jobs. And then you have models like Blue Apron that ironically look a lot like how we thought about grocers in the 1920s, where you're getting just the ingredients you need for this meal, but you're not really interacting with too many human workers in the process. And really, I think what we're seeing, whether it's in the grocery store, in corporate America, wherever, is that cycle times for how we're defining work are speeding up. We are rapidly iterating on the order of not generations, but just a couple of years on what a job actually is, what tasks are part of somebody's job. Who is hiring for that job? Is it the grocer? Is it the consumer? Is it a third-party platform? And how people are actually compensated for doing that work. And that is exciting, change is interesting, but it's also kind of scary because it frames up this design question of what do we actually design for a world in which jobs are rebundling every couple of years and not every generation. And I think there's a lot of challenges that we're going to face, we are facing right now, associated with that. One is that we know that when we are switching between different jobs pretty often, our organizations are not well set up for that. I'm sure that's the case for many of you guys here in this room. Turnover is really expensive. Knowledge transfer is really hard. So what are we supposed to design for that? We know that when jobs themselves are switching and changing, the tasks associated with switching and changing, we have this huge question about skills. How do we make sure that we, as workers and organizations, are prepared for that? To be honest, most of our models for retraining and reskilling within workforces are expensive, they're slow, they're usually not very effective. And we also know that we have a big issue with how we think about compensation and how we think about who generates value from the work that's being done. We've seen all those graphs about return to capital versus return to labor. We've seen models where we have third-party platforms creating a ton of value that is really not shared with the worker at the end of the day. And so these are challenges that are big and systemic and scary. And I think at the CoLab, what we want to do is take those high-level challenges and say, what can we prototype, what can we make, and what can we learn from that to design a future of work that's ultimately better for humans? And so I'm going to share a few examples of some ways that we're going after that. The first one is organizationally. So we know that 30% of Americans, and it's growing, are doing project-based work, whether that's Uber drivers, freelancing for software, whatever. But we don't actually have very good organizational structures that support project-based work, that actually start to distribute power, knowledge to the edges of organizations as opposed to holding it really tightly in headquarters. So over here, you'll see an example from BrainTrust, who you guys have heard from the founders a little bit. They're an IDEO CoLab portfolio company that has a really interesting model of thinking about how do we distribute this capability of software development to the edges of a network, whether they're in your organizational walls or not, and actually say, we're not just going to distribute the task of doing that work, but actually the power and value that's created to the very edges of that network. So we're going to be piloting with them a little bit later this year and really thinking about and experimenting with what does it mean to work for and with a distributed organization. We know that if people are starting to work in more project-based work, they're starting to work in the gig economy, our whole model for compensation and benefits completely breaks. Like we, at least in the US, have tied all of our understanding of the social contract into W-2 employment and long-term affiliations with a single employer. And that's really problematic if that's not how people are working. And so we're really interested in designing compensations and benefit systems that are portable, that actually enable workers to achieve some level of long-term stability while pursuing the work that they want to do. So on the right is a prototype we built with some of you guys here in the CoLab called Dino Health. There was a really interesting example of what could we experiment with here. So Dino Health was a distributed health insurance platform for Uber drivers, where rather than having to go through Uber the company to access healthcare, drivers could collectivize into these small-scale collectives and actually collaboratively negotiate for cheaper healthcare, much like what you would do with an insurance company, but they didn't need to go through an organization in order to do that. I talked a little bit about the skill gap. We know that if jobs are going to change constantly, we don't have the ability to build skills quickly enough to actually solve for that. I think Matt shared this stat earlier, but 65% of kindergartners are going to have jobs that don't exist yet. We're expecting that the average tenure with organizations is decreasing by years. So what are we doing for that? Because the way to learn doesn't actually sit in organizational walls. We need to think about how we break the learn, earn, return paradigm and actually start to invest in lifelong learning and skilling capabilities. This is an interesting model. It was done in the city of Chicago and Columbus. It's called LRNG. It's a citywide platform that thinks about how many organizations can start to offer micro skill certifications. So in this case, it's like Gap offering punctuality and teamwork, Nerdy Media offering you a certification in podcasts. And they offer that not just to their current employees, but actually to the entire city, because it's both a mechanism to bring talent within their walls, but also to equip and enable their own talent. And then ultimately, we at the CoLab, we believe if we just invest in automation, that's just a race to the bottom. And so we're really interested in thinking about how are we measuring, growing, and valuing the uniquely human competencies that our workforce is bringing to the table? And how can we think about technology not just as a substitute for human work, but actually an augmenter of it? So this is a prototype we built actually last January alongside Fidelity. It's called Amico. And it was really addressing this challenge of organizations saying, hey, we really need soft skills. We really need workers who bring these quote unquote soft skills. They need to be creative or they need to be collaborative. We don't know how to define that, how to measure that, how we actually know if someone's bringing that to the table. What I really like about this prototype is it leveraged emerging technology. It used facial expression analysis and sentiment analysis to look at, for the worker, when they were sharing a story about their work, what soft skills were they actually putting out there, but then use that to equip them to kind of give their own new resume of their own soft skills and empower them to build a different career path. And ultimately, we're really excited about what we can build together. We think that these are big challenges, but they're solvable challenges if we work together. We can make responsive organizational structures that don't just solve for the end consumer, but actually solve for the people that we are working with. We think that we can design a better employment contract, something fairer between workers and employers that actually enables people to move fluidly to the projects and opportunities that are most interesting or valuable or relevant to them. And ultimately, we think that we can work together to create better jobs for more people. We can create new jobs, we can create jobs that work better and create more value for people. But all those things are underlined because, to be honest, it's something that we need to define. It's something that we need to work on to figure out because they're exciting and like big visions, but it's actually going to take a lot of work to get there. And ultimately, I think what we're most excited about is reframing our narrative from thinking about humans as resources that can be replaced with machines and will be, to actually saying, how do we work together to intentionally design for and invest in a dynamic human workforce? And so I'm so excited to continue that conversation with all of you guys today.